I would like to thank everyone that has made time to join us today to our second webinar following the change that we had to make in how we progress due to the COVID pandemic. My name is Bikim Tombeni. I am a member of SACRA. SACRA is the organization in South Africa, a blanket organization that represents all different stakeholders in the industry. We advocate, we educate, we monitor, and we mentor when it comes to all kind of clinical trials related activities in South Africa. Our webinar today is the advancement of clinical trials in South Africa during and post COVID-19 era. So I'm just going to take you through the agenda. I will not go much into the detail because for each and every session, you will be introduced to the team that will be providing you with the update. All right, why did we see that it's necessary for us to actually theme our today's conference, today's webinar to the advancement of clinical trials during the COVID era? We are all affected when it comes to how we had to shift in the way we work, in the way we progress, in the way we plan, and in the way we need to move ahead and how we need to continue with our business daily. However, South Africa has also its own challenges when it comes to the number of clinical trials that have been conducted over the past few years. The slide below here shows you how the market has shifted when you look at South Africa versus the international number of clinical trials. This data comes from the clinicaltrials.gov, and you are able to see that. Hello? Hello? I don't know if I should continue. Elandra, can you maybe mute everyone?
Hi, Becky. We've just gone through a housekeeping mute round here. Just be aware it may possibly have muted you as well. I'm going to unmute you. Okay, I think we should be back now, Becky.
Okay, so if you look at the number of clinical trials over the past years, you can see that things have gone down in the number of clinical trials have gone down in South Africa, and hence we want to meet with different expert team today to discuss the clinical trials pipeline to see if a shift in the global forecasting will have any impact. The shift due to COVID-19 will have any impact in the global forecasting and the investment in clinical trials, all different clinical trials, including those that are COVID related and those that are not COVID related. So we want to actually have, we have a panel of experts that will be talking about this point today. And then my next slide. So my next slide, we're also going to look at different ethical changes, different site approaches, and also community perspective when it comes to how clinical trials are integrated during the COVID era and also for business as we continue. I would like to introduce you to our first speaker, who is Dr. Clare Cutland, who is scientific coordinator at ALIVE, which is the African Leadership in Vaccinology Expertise at Wits University, which is led by Prof. Rees and Prof. Madi. She will be covering a topic on an overview of a Wits University COVID-19 clinical trial. So I will hand over to Dr. Cutland from here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, Andrew, will you just confirm it's presenting okay?
Yes, we're good to go. Thanks, Doc.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present today. As Becky said, my name is Clare Cutland. I'm a medical doctor trained at Wits, and I have spent the last 20 years working with Prof. Madi, 18 of those years at Krisani Baragwanath Hospital at his research site, the Respiratory Meningeal Pathogens Research Unit, and the last year and a half as a scientific coordinator for the African Leadership and Vaccinology Expertise, or ALIVE. So I'm going to go through a couple of slides on the background of why do we need the COVID vaccine studies in Africa, and give you an update on the vaccine trial that is being conducted in South Africa at the moment. So from the slide that you can see on the screen at the moment, this is just showing the drastic and very rapid rise in the number of COVID-19 cases that has occurred since it was first identified in late December. And this is particularly looking from March, early March 2020 to now. When we look at the number of tests that are being done per 1,000 people, South Africa is sitting about halfway up this group ahead of the number of people tested per 1,000 in South Korea. So our testing is, as far as Africa goes, we're doing the most number of tests per 1,000 people in the population. However, we still are behind many of the other countries, particularly developed countries, in testing per 1,000 people. What we have seen over the last couple of weeks is the drastic increase in the average number of cases of COVID that have been diagnosed each day. Over the last week, we've been seeing in excess of 10 to 12,000 cases being diagnosed each day in South Africa, which is more than what was seen in other countries, including Italy and Spain at their peaks. The South African Medical Research Council has recently released a report on the weekly deaths in South Africa. And the slide on the screen at the moment is showing the national excess death rate, and this was reported as of the 7th of July. So there's a forecast death rate, which is in the solid orange line, and that changes, sits around about 8,000, but goes up and down through the year, with a higher rate of death in the winter months. There's an upper and a lower predicted bound, but what we can see for what's happened this year, the black lines is showing that there's been this drastic increase in the number of deaths related to natural causes, particularly from the late May onwards. So there's been almost 11,000 excess deaths reported in the country since the 6th of May. However, at the time point on which this graph was published, there had been just over 3,500 COVID-related deaths diagnosed, which leaves a shortfall of almost 7,000 deaths, which were excess to what would normally be expected. However, were not directly related or identified to be COVID related, and may well have been COVID related. However, the COVID testing may not have been done. This is reflected in all the provinces as well. The top left graph being the Western Cape, which has had almost 3,700 excess deaths, but just over 2,000 deaths directly associated to COVID. I know many of you have heard about the updates and the epidemiology of COVID. Initially, it was thought to be spread by droplets only, in droplets, which then dropped down onto, and the main form of spread was contact transmission. More recently, with the research that's coming out globally, airborne transmission has been confirmed. So smaller particles remain, including the virus, remain airborne and hang around in the environment for longer than if they were in larger droplets, which would drop onto a contact. This has got significant implications for infection control, particularly in enclosed, small, confined spaces. And the fact that there's now airborne transmission confirmed basically strengthens the requirement for keeping windows open and closed spaces, increasing social distancing, and wearing masks. Infected people are found to be most infectious in the 2 to 3 days before they become symptomatic and for the 7 days after the onset of symptoms. So what has happened in South Africa? As you're well aware, we've had the lockdown, and the number of cases diagnosed during the lockdown dropped significantly. However, what's happened subsequently is we've had this little storm of drastic increase in the COVID-related cases and deaths since level 5 lockdown was lifted. So why is a COVID vaccine required? There's a prediction, there's been multiple modeling done looking at how is this disease actually going to continue and spread around the globe. Is it going to is there going to be one outbreak and then the curve is going to flatten? The bottom left is showing what's happened here in South Africa, where there's been a small peak and then now we've hit a drastic rise. Are they going to be repeated multiple small outbreaks or repeated with repeated larger outbreaks? With the virus only having been identified 6-7 months ago, the way it's actually acting is not well known at this point. I'm going to give a very brief overview of the vaccines that there are. There's different technologies used to make vaccines. So one of the technologies is what's called a protein-based vaccines. So they can be either protein subunit vaccines or virus-like particles. Novavax has developed a virus-like particle vaccine against COVID, and it has initiated clinical trials in Australia, the phase 1 clinical trials with their virus-like particle vaccine. Vaccines can also be developed using technology, using nucleic acid technology. So these can either be DNA, based on DNA, or based on the RNA. The Inovio DNA has developed a DNA plasmid vaccine, and that has initiated clinical trials globally, well, in the US particularly. The Moderna vaccine was the first vaccine to go into humans, and it was introduced, the first dose was given 63 days after the genetic code was identified. And this is an RNA vaccine, which has been developed by the NIAID and Moderna in the US. There are also whole viruses, which can be either weakened or inactivated to make vaccines. And then what I do want to spend a little bit more time on is just the viral vector vaccines. So these are vaccines that use a virus to deliver the genes into the cell and provokes an immune response. And the reason I'm wanting to spend a bit of time on this particular one is because the vaccine trial that has been initiated in South Africa is using a viral vector vaccine. So the viral vector vaccines can either be replicating viral vectors or non-replicating viral vectors, such as adenovirus. And what happens with the viral vector vaccine, it can cause, the actual viral vector can cause either mild illness or no illness at all in humans. They efficiently deliver the genetic code for the target epitope into the host cell, and they rely on the host's cellular machinery to produce a protein that is then released into the circulation and processed by the antigen-presenting cells to induce adaptive immunity. The development steps of a vaccine normally can take 15 to 20 years. It has been the speed at which the COVID vaccines have gone into clinical trials is absolutely unprecedented, and basically pushed these 20 years into a matter of months. One of the reasons that this speed up could happen was that a lot of the technology that is being used now, for example, the viral vectors or the RNA, had been in clinical trial previously for other pathogens. As an example, the adenovirus viral vector that is used for the vaccine developed by Oxford University had already undergone clinical trials for MERS, which is a coronavirus, as well as SARS from 2003. So the vaccine development goes through discovery and target validation, preclinical staging, and then normally that takes 3 to 8 years, and then eventually goes into phase 1 human testing, progressing to, which is safety, progressing to phase 2, focusing on safety and immunogenicity, and phase 3, focusing on safety, efficacy, and regulatory approval. As I was saying, this timeline has been accelerated rapidly for the COVID vaccines. We're now heading into phase 2 and phase 3 vaccine trials in just over 6 months. So, at the moment, there are 130 vaccines that are still in preclinical development. There's been 17 vaccines that are in phase 1 development, 9 in phase 2, and 3 in phase 3. And to date, there are no vaccines approved for general use. As I mentioned, there's an array of technologies being used to develop these vaccines. The way the vaccines work is they must present antigen to the immune system that stimulates an immune response that can block or destroy the virus if the participant becomes infected. So there are 29 vaccines currently in human studies. One must keep in mind that of all vaccines that go into human trials, only about 10% of them are eventually licensed for use. So the trial that has been initiated in South Africa is entitled an adaptive phase 1-2 randomized placebo-controlled trial to determine the safety, immunogenicity, and efficacy of non-replicating ChAdOx SARS-CoV-2 vaccine in South African adults living with and without HIV. The national principal investigator for this trial is Prof. Shabir Mahdi, who is the Professor of Vaccinology at the University of the Witwatersrand and the Director of RMPRU VIDA based at Baragwanath Hospital. The protocol has undergone a couple of version amendments, which I'm happy to discuss later, and the current protocol, which is in use, is protocol version 3.1, which was dated the 13th of July. There are 7 trial sites in South Africa. 5 of these sites are in Gauteng. 3 sites are actively recruiting. There are 3 sites based in Gauteng, and 2 additional sites will initiate enrollment by the 27th of July. There's an additional 2 sites based in the Western Cape, which will initiate enrollment by the 27th of July, which is next week, Monday. So how has this vaccine actually been made? It's been developed by the the Jenner Institute at the Oxford University and the Oxford Vaccine Group. The genes coding for the spike protein have been inserted into an adenovirus viral vector. And a portion of the adenovirus, it's a non-human primate adenovirus, some of the genetic material has also been removed to ensure that the adenovirus vector is non-replicating. Once the vaccine is given to humans, and because it's non-replicating, it is unable to cause disease. The cells of the body express the spike protein, and then the body produces antibodies against the spike protein that's produced. So where is this particular vaccine in the development path? The vaccine has undergone and completed animal models, including non-human primate and proof of principle studies on efficacy. Additionally, the phase 1 trial was conducted in the UK to look at safety and dosage. And very hot off the press, the preliminary results were published in the Lancet on Monday this week. The results of the phase 1 trial showed that there were no early safety concerns, that the vaccine induces strong immune response in both parts of the immune system. So it provokes a T-cell response within 14 days of vaccination, and it also provokes an antibody response within 28 days of vaccination. So moving on from that, where is it now? The phase 1 trial was completed in the UK, and in the UK there are 10,000 participants being enrolled in a phase 2 to 3 study trial looking at safety, immunogenicity, and efficacy. Additionally, these studies have been initiated in South Africa. We will be enrolling 2,020 participants, and Brazil will be enrolling 5,000 participants. Additionally, the US has planned a larger study, phase 3 study, looking to enroll 30,000 participants. What has happened in South Africa to date? The protocol was developed with the assistance of, based on the Oxford University's protocol, but adapted for the South African setting, and also to increase HIV, people living with HIV for the first time as well. It underwent expedited regulatory reviews through the Human Research Ethics Committee at the University of the Witwatersrand, as well as the South African Health Products Regulatory Authority, or SACRA. Approvals from Wits, HRIC, and SACRA were received before the early June. Oxford University's committee, which oversees international trials, approval was also received in the second week in June. This vaccine is a genetically modified vaccine, as I've just elaborated on, and therefore it required approval by the Department of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries, or DAF. As many of you may well know, DAF approval requires a 30-day public comment period, and that public comment period was completed in the 12th of June, and we received our DAF approval by the 15th of June. The additional 2 sites in the Western Cape are affiliated to the University of Cape Town and University of Stellenbosch. Since I finished this slide, the University of Cape Town ethics approval has been received as of an hour ago, and the University of Stellenbosch ethics approval is pending. The participants in this group will be trial will be enrolled into 3 different groups. Group 1 initially was meant to have 50 participants, and this is an intensive safety and immunogenicity group. These are all HIV uninfected participants, and they received 2 doses 4 weeks apart. Participants in group 2 are also HIV uninfected participants, and it's a group which is looking at safety, intensive immunogenicity, and vaccine efficacy. And according to the protocol, which, as I mentioned earlier, it's an adaptive protocol, the protocol says that it's a single use of the investigational product unless data from group 1 or other trials indicate that 2 doses are required to obtain adequate immune responses. As an update on that, as of the last week, 2 doses will be given to all participants in the South African trial. And this is based on the data that have been released from the UK phase 1 trial. Group 3 in this trial will be a group of 50 people living with HIV who will undergo intensive safety and immunogenicity follow-ups. All the participants will be followed up for 12 months after receipt of the vaccine, and they will have, depending on which group they're in, they will have between 6 and 12 routine visits, and additionally they will come in for any illness visits as well. The inclusion criteria for the study volunteers includes providing written informed consent, and that includes an assessment of understanding. They have to achieve at least 8 out of 10 for a question, a little test that's administered during the consenting process. Healthy adults between the ages of 18 and 65 are being enrolled, and apart from the 50 group 3 participants, they need to be HIV negative. Participants also need to be able and willing to comply with study requirements, and female participants need to be willing to practice continuous effective contraception and have negative pregnancy tests. For the HIV infected group, the participants need to be on established antiretrovirals and have an HIV viral load of less than 1,000 copies per mole. Exclusion criteria for the trial include participants being SARS-CoV-2 positive on their nasal swab within 96 hours prior to vaccination. They also cannot be on any proven, using any proven registered or unregistered treatments for COVID, be pregnant or lactating, and have chronic diseases including asthma, severe, particularly uncontrolled asthma, and be obese or have a new onset of cough or shortness of breath. So as far as why we want to vaccinate, the herd immunity is an important concept to understand. If we look at the top pictures, the bluey purple people are not immunized, but they're still healthy. And as you get the red little people who are sick and contagious coming into the population, so the number of the sick and contagious people in that population grows. If some people in the population in the second picture develop immunity, like the little yellow people, so there's some protection. What we need to get to is a situation where approximately 2/3 of the population need to develop immunity before the reproductive number of COVID is going to drop below 1, which means that each person who's infected will only infect one other. At the moment, the reproductive ratio for COVID is sitting around 2.5. So it's unlikely that we'll have good herd immunity in South Africa for the next year or so. What are the anticipated and the actual timelines on our trial? The first participant was enrolled on the 24th of June, and the aim is to complete enrollment across multiple sites in South Africa by mid-August. Participants, as I said, will be followed up for 12 months after vaccination, and efficacy or protection may be determined when approximately 42 COVID-19 cases have been identified. And these cases include participants who become infected or identified to be infected with SARS-CoV-2 at least 14 days after receipt of the vaccine. There's an independent safety monitoring committee, which was established initially for the UK trials, but the same team has been supplemented with at least 2 African members, including 1 South African DSMB member and a Kenyan DSMB member, and they are overseeing the safety monitoring for all the trials in the UK, Brazil, and South Africa. So at the moment, the current progress, the numbers, as of end of last week and early this week, there were 704 participants had been screened and consented and had undergone all the screening procedures, including safety, screening bloods, and their swab. There'd been, of the 704, 30% of them were screening failures. The majority of those screening failures were people who either had a chronic disease, some of them previously undiagnosed diabetes, undiagnosed hypertension, and obesity. We've also had quite a few participants who have tested positive on their nasal swab, despite being totally asymptomatic. As of now, the current enrollment, so as of early this week, the current enrollment, we've enrolled 349 participants, and into groups one. Group one was completed, as 50 were completed. However, the sample size has been adapted and increased to 70. So that is going to increase shortly. They will be enrolled in the next week. There's been a fair amount of media interest, good and bad, with the trial. There was a protest outside Wits about 2 weeks ago. There's also been some very positive media and public figures coming and being vaccinated. So as you can see, excuse me, as you can see from these photos, there's been several senior Wits academics who have been enrolled and received either vaccine or placebo, including our Dean of Health Sciences at Wits, Prof. Vella. So at the moment, there is no vaccine licensed, and it is essential to continue with the non-pharmaceutical interventions to try and reduce the rate of transmission or flatten the curve. So these obviously include what we're hearing extensively is regular hand washing, avoiding touching the face, social distancing, cough and sneeze etiquette, staying at home, and wearing masks. So in conclusion, there's various stages of the current wave of the COVID-19 outbreak in South Africa, and we can potentially expect multiple waves of the outbreak going all the way through into 2022. Vaccine trials are underway in South Africa and progressing well. At the moment, it is the Oxford University adenovirus vaccine, non-replicating viral vector vaccine that is currently under trial. There are potentially other COVID-19 vaccine candidates that may undergo clinical trials in South Africa in the upcoming months. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Cutland. That was a great presentation, and we really are supposed to be actively participating in South Africa, looking at the number of infections. I will not take questions now because I think we've gone a little bit beyond our time, and I don't see any questions on the chat, unless if there are questions on the chat, Landre, I don't see any. If there is no question on the chat, we can just continue to our next session. So I hand over to Nikki. Nikki and Dr. Medal, I hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Becky. This is Michelle Middle speaking, and thank you to everyone who joined us for this webinar. So, Dr. Cutler, this was an excellent presentation. Thank you so much for providing us with this a very interesting background, because I think this is excellent background for the rest of this webcast. So we are now continuing with the panel discussion. Obviously, we all know that COVID, as Dr. Cutler just said, is with us for at least 24 months, and unless a miracle happens, which we all hope will happen. But this is probably the reality is 2 to 3 years. So we also know, we've heard that many times, that the economy is probably going to kill more people because of the impact that it's having on our population than the virus itself, which is why it's so extremely important that we look as an industry to how we can protect this industry and continue with clinical trials also beyond COVID trials. Our panelist this afternoon reflects 3 sectors. So it is from a pharma perspective, from a site perspective, and then we also have someone from the ethics committee. So I would like to introduce you to our 2 panelists from pharma industry, Mr. Nathaniel Ramuthaga. He is from Roche, a country manager at Roche, but with extensive experience since 1995. But he will be representing IPASA, and he will be telling us about the clinical trials pipeline and his view on what's happening globally, but also specifically in South Africa. And Mr. Alex Lopes is a Novartis country head, and he will be co-discussing with Mr. Ramuthaga. So, Mr. Ramuthaga, thanks very much. I'm handing over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Middle. I hope you can hear me. Thanks for
loud and clear. Thank you.
The organizer for unmuting me. I tried to unmute myself, but the control was in higher office. As already announced, I'm Nathaniel Ramuthaga. I've been around trying to save lives through clinical trials for some time, and today represent IPASA here. What I would like to sort of touch base is just to introduce what IPASA represents, or who is IPASA. IPASA is represented by 26 research-based pharmaceutical companies in South Africa. However, there are still a number of those research-based companies that are not necessarily members of IPASA. For whatever good reasons, they have not joined or they either withdrew. So I would deal only with the perspective from what the contributions of IPASA members have been doing for this country for some time now. Over the last 3 years, IPASA members have introduced 80% of the new molecules which have been brought to market in South Africa. IPASA aims to include promotion of an environment for sustainable patient access to innovative research-based healthcare, and they take it very seriously. If we look at maybe things that I would look at to consider today, some scenarios and some questions that I will pose to the audience, and as we can discuss some of the issues which my distinguished or honorable colleague Alex will also touch base on some of the aspects of trying to answer some of the issues, what pharma companies are doing to try and move forward, is that there are issues to look at. Clinical trials and the challenges of COVID-19, both especially with the specific reference to Africa and also specifically to South Africa. What are the gaps we're already seeing in clinical trials conduct before COVID-19, and how do we close that gap which has been compounded by the intricacies and the quagmire of COVID-19? Is pharma making any adjustments to ensure Africa remains a viable market for trials? It's a question we need to also delve with and answer correctly, because it's a multiple sort of stakeholder question that needs to be responded to. What are the strengths we can leverage on as a region or as a country? Is Africa or African data important or critical to the global clinical research narrative? How do we ensure that African region remains viable as a market for clinical trials, for investment and forecasting? It's a very critical thing that we need to respond to. And in trying to respond to some of the scenarios that Dr. Middle painted, I looked at almost like about 15 of the 26 companies that are members of IPASA currently. The end of 2019 sort of outlook for phase 1 to phase 3 sort of pipeline and projects, which combine of those 15 top 15 companies of the 26 were just over 980 in terms of the projects that were planned for the next 2 to 3 years. And when you look at that picture, I recently went back to the reference pharma projects and as well as the forecast by analysts for 7th of July 2020, and re-looked at about 12 of those 26 companies. And the phase 1 to phase 3 molecules and pipeline have increased to almost over 1,000, which means that business is booming for pharma companies. However, for 2020, if we look at it, the scenarios of COVID-19 has spun everything upside down. However, can we re-look at the fact of the matter that for R&D and critically for pharma companies, venture capitalists invest their money and they want to see return on investment. Yes, it saves lives. It's about patients at the end of the day. However, there's a need for R&D to look at how do we reduce the cost, time, risk of making strategic decisions of those molecules that are in development. Looking at the data for the last 2 decades into those pipelines that I've spoken about and into almost 2026, which is informed by both R&D and commercial data for all new chemical entities. The future looks bright. Even for us in the southern tip of the continent, I think we can claim a stake and make ourselves attractive to attract some of that research that is really clamoring to go to other countries. Yes, COVID-19 impact on clinical trials in Africa has really had a huge impact. But however, within COVID, we can also claim that we have remained agile as a country. So we need to look at some of the practical aspects that has happened on the ground because of the impact of COVID. How many patients have missed their prescriptions for clinical trials because of COVID? Some in the early days of lockdown, sites were closed or they were not accessible. Companies, CROs had to be agile to create and find solutions to deliver IMP to patients at home, direct to patient deliveries. So at the end of the day, what was the risk? Is the data evaluable for those particular patients? Do they meet protocol requirements if we see that challenge of COVID-19 as an impact? However, what types of medications have been put by pharma companies and CROs in managing those trials? I would like to share maybe some of examples of things that have happened that are still going to happen in terms of mitigation. Patients not getting enough prescriptions based on their protocol, where people had to adjust windows or visit windows to allow for patients to come later, and becomes a protocol deviation. Adding additional visits, the direct to patient, which I indicated earlier. And in many times, protocol to protocol mitigation, the remote monitoring enhanced or remote monitoring on steroids during COVID-19. Decrease in reporting of AEs, not only by sites, but also by patients themselves, because they didn't want to go to see the doctor, or they wouldn't even be permitted in some cases. The inaction of remote site initiation visit for those sites that still had allowed for protocols to proceed. Centralized monitoring KPIs re-looked at in a different way because of COVID-19. Data integrity for missed data is a question that needed to be answered as well. However, those are the issues whereby, as industry, we need to evaluate each site before COVID, during, and after for glaring differences? And how do we show up post-COVID in terms of moving forward? As Dr. Cutland indicated, we're not sure when COVID scenarios are, and the pandemic is going to stop. As she said, maybe up till 2022. But somehow, somewhere, we need to adjust so that business continues. How do we survive or adapt with or without COVID, and then do things differently? There's been a massive reduction of new patients due to fear and risk of contracting a disease at health facilities. How do we mitigate that aspect? During COVID-19, applications to SACRA, we have seen the agility of SACRA in some cases whereby we can, for the record now, start to say they can approve a trial within 30 to 40 days. How do we show up with SACRA engagement as industry post-COVID with what we have seen being able to be attributable to the agility of SACRA during this time? What are the areas where we still need them to improve for us so that we can remain competitive to the global world and then be able to bid for those trials? I mean, I'm saying this because in some cases we have seen countries like Italy at the peak of their the pandemic in their country, they were still able to enroll patients in oncology and other therapeutic areas. Whereas with us in the early days, everything just came to a standstill. And in some instances, in some sites, some public facilities, it remains at standstill even today. So how do we adjust so that we remain competitive? Because COVID is going to be here for some time. There also has been rate limiting approval timelines within our industry, more especially with provincial approvals, which we observed even during COVID-19 pandemic, that SACRA will do its part and ethics committees will do its part. I think Marzelle will share with us the new ways of working and the new ways of the normal in terms of approving clinical trials, in terms of agility and adaptability by ethics committees, not only within the regulatory space for ourselves. How do we engage the provincial establishments through the Ministry of Health to really look at that? As Dr. Middle mentioned, we need to restore the country back to business, but we also need to do it with circumspection of making sure that everybody's safe and taken care of and nobody's at risk. The other challenge is that from the pharma perspective, where I sit from a IPASA perspective, is that a multi-stakeholders environment, it's always a challenge in that all stakeholders need to come to the party in terms of creating the enabling environment for the process to be smooth and also to meet timelines and the agility that's required in removing barriers to progress and including all the interventions that need to happen. And if we look at that picture, we should really proceed without more concern as to whether we'll be able to compete or not. If we look at other countries, for example, similar countries that are experiencing the same sort of scenario of a peak infections like Russia and Brazil. Last week I spoke to some of my colleagues in Brazil and Russia as well. The ability of the regulators to still work even within this pandemic and making sure that they enable the approvals of trials, it's taking place within almost also around 35 days, and which means that we are not far from where they are and we need to be able to compete. And on that note, I will hand over to my honorable colleague, Alex, to take this process forward. Thank you very much.
I'll entertain you guys with my lockdown face at the moment. Thank you very much, Nathaniel. Some great insights there. And a key thing I'd like to echo is that the future does look bright. We're really primed at the moment to decide our own fate going forward in the future. I think the key message is how we react now is really going to be what sets us up going forward. It's very difficult to keep it in context at the moment. We're in our direct environment and we see what affects us, but the whole world is in turmoil. And if you look from a pharma industry perspective, all companies and their headquarters are in the same position, and success is relative. So there's a lot of work going into looking at reprioritization, looking at what's key, what do we need to do now, what can wait. And it's clear that everyone's goals have shifted, and it's not just ours. So it's a matter of placing ourselves in a way that we are key to the success for our companies. And it's also key to remember that we are an essential industry, and there's a need for us, and we have to continue doing what we're doing. At the same time, we need to be flexible. If we look at the slide that Vicky presented at the beginning, the downward trend of trials coming into South Africa was there from before COVID. So the message is consistent. Despite it, what COVID has done is really it's accelerated the whole process for us. And I think it's key for us also to focus on our strengths. It's been mentioned before, we've got diversity of data. There have been more and more discussions coming up around the world about getting a wider representation of all demographics. We have a record of providing good quality. So providing viable data to our trials so that can be used for global submissions. And looking at real success and looking at reprioritization, what companies are looking at essentially is speed. We're looking at costs and things like that, but the one major cost driver is speed. So Dr. Cutland said about how the vaccines, COVID vaccines it's unprecedented how quickly these are being developed at the moment. And essentially that's what we need to pull through across the board in the pipelines of all companies, is unlocking what is making things faster, and what can we bring it through into our daily work so that we can essentially get our medicines to patients quicker. Firstly, if it's quicker, there's less to spend on resource, and secondly, companies get to recover all of their costs faster if a drug is registered quicker. And the keys to speed, it involves all of us. So from a pharma side, it's getting our house in order. The sites, it's startup times. It's something that we talk about a lot. How quickly can we start? And then from the regulatory, from SACRA and from the ethics committees, how can we work together to ensure that we get all our approvals in place to start up quickly? And ultimately, what this all is, for anyone in my position in any of the pharma companies, is it's a marketing exercise. We're selling our country. We're not seen as an essential participant in trials. We're small. We're not in the US. We're not part of the EU, not in Japan, where filings have to happen for all companies. But we have a lot to give and a lot to sell. And that's something that we all need to do across the board. We need to do it as all companies, and also, I mean, from CROs, from sites. It's all about how we represent the country and build the trust. And all this while at the same time doing the right thing for the safety of our people, the people that work for us, and for our patients. That's what it's all about. And I think that's where we really shift gears into how are we doing things and how we're going to do things in the future. How can we do things better? I think normal is the one phrase for 2020, but that's really what we're talking about. At Novartis, we made a decision early on that we're not going to send anyone out unless it's completely essential. So we haven't done any monitoring on site, and it's really pushed us. It's a discussion that's been happening for years. We wanted risk-based monitoring to come in. We needed to relook and rethink at how we were doing our remote monitoring. And COVID has forced many industries, and especially ours, to look inward and say, okay, well, look, there's nothing stopping us from doing this now. Microsoft Teams I didn't even know existed before this year, and it's something now I spend 9 hours a day on the platform, and it's something that you can share across any stakeholders. Sites and sponsors can have any kind of visit. You can have multiple people from a company attending without taking any space at a site. So all this is well and good during COVID, but why not pull this through when the environment is clear? We can save resource for our sites, we can save time traveling, time and money. And it's really about thinking about how can we make life easier for everyone, and breaking down the perceived barriers, whether it be internally or between stakeholders, and that's where engagements like this are key, and we have to keep doing this across the industry to make sure that we're talking and we're reimagining how we're doing things. So from a pharma perspective, we've relooked at all of our clinical operations procedures. Our SOPs have been refined, our monitoring plans. There are obviously some key things that we can't stop, we can't change, but we look at it and think, what can we change? Nathaniel mentioned things like getting our drug directly to patients, things like that. And also with regards to reviewing source, there are a number of platforms out there. There are platforms that also 21 CFR Part 11 approved to share source. So you can have a CRA, for example, doing their normal STB, and then you can also have a medical monitor logging in and either doing training or checking for certain safety signals. So it gives you much more reach, much more penetration into our oversight of how we are doing trials. And then I think the key engagement then is with the sites as well. So it's a big ask. We understand as well as a pharma company to come in and say, hey guys, we're going to change the way we do things. We come from a different perspective. We don't have the daily challenges of a site. We don't have patients queuing up. We don't have different equipment that we need to maneuver around, perhaps IT issues, things like that. But it's something that we do need to keep progressing. How can we implement more platforms at sites? Might be as simple as getting certain hardware upgraded so that you can have software like Teams installed, getting webcams and things like that. And eventually the discussion needs to progress into things like how do we get electronic medical records to be a standard at sites and practices as opposed to an exception. That digital aspect of it is really key, because that essentially, like I said, it frees up so much resource. It saves us space, it saves travel time, you can have more eyes, and what we're looking at is getting clean data and making everything auditable so that we can all set ourselves up for success. And the final aspect of it is our engagement with the regulatory partners. So we need to keep working with SACRA. It's been incredible to see. We've also submitted a couple of COVID-19 protocols, and the turnaround time has been phenomenal. Getting approvals within 2 weeks, everything being electronic, getting checklists, allowing time for responses. It shows what we're capable of, it shows what the sites are capable of, and it shows what SACRA is capable of. And I think when the dust settles a bit, or as it's settling, because it's going to take a while, we should be having the discussion saying, hey, look, we did this. What stops us for doing this for every single protocol that we submit? If I can go to my global heads and say, look, this is our average time in South Africa, you're still battling with countries that are taking 5 to 9 months to start up. If you can come to South Africa and we can do everything within 3 to 4 months consistently, I can guarantee you now that we will become a key partner, and you'll see that 0.35% or whatever it was of global trials that we're participating in, that will spike very quickly. And then also with our ethics committees as well. I think there needs to be a lot of engagement between pharma sites and ethics committees, and perhaps between ethics committees as well, looking at what can we do to improve, improving quality of submissions, what needs to be included. And I think for all parties as well, how do we get new tools and platforms through the system and approved a lot quicker? Right now, if something comes up, we've got a concern to think, okay, well, a global wants to do this. How long is it going to take to get it through SACRA? How long is it going to take to get through the ethics committees? Will the sites agree to try a new technology? We need to unlock how can we sit together and discuss and quickly to get something innovative implemented if it's going to make everyone's life a lot easier. And that's it for me today. Thank you very much.
Alex and Nathaniel, thank you so much. It was really brilliant. I think what I was looking for today was really that glimmer of hope that we can be hopeful for our pharmaceutical industry in South Africa and also the future of clinical trials in South Africa. And I think you both gave us, well, certainly you gave me a lot of confidence in this. Now, I would like just to summarize this because we are running a bit behind time. So just to summarize the pharma aspects. What I really liked about what both of you basically said is that it's in our hands really. How we react now will determine our future, as Alex had said, and that we must remember that the whole world is in turmoil. It's not just South Africa, but clinical trials is essential services, and it is up to us to really become smarter and become more agile and learn from how we do COVID-related research and really implement that across non-COVID clinical trials. And there's a lot of learnings that we know we can take from COVID. And I know that we will continue this discussion also going forward. Thank you again, both of you. I would now like to ask Dr. Mitha to now touch on at the sites perspective, what is happening at the sites in for COVID and non-COVID clinical trials, because we know that with respect to the economic aspects, there are thousands of clinical trial sites in South Africa, and it's crucial that those sites continue with business, conducting both COVID and non-COVID clinical trials. So Dr. Mitha will take the lead. And then he will also involve Susanne Rolse, who is from Baragwana Hospital. Both of them have considerable experience in the industry, more than 14 years. And Dr. Mitha has also started numerous clinical trial sites, and he's also very actively involved in training investigators and setting up research sites in South Africa. He is also an EXCO member, a SACRA EXCO member. Thank you, Dr. Mitha.
Thanks, Dr. Middle, for having me, and thanks for that kind introduction. And thank you to all of the previous speakers as well. It gives us a great oversight of what is going on in the country at the moment. You know, from site level, it's obviously very, very difficult because, as everybody knows, sites are pretty disjointed as such. And with the COVID-19 pandemic hitting us globally in such a short space of time, there wasn't any reliable information that was available to sites about how to proceed in conducting work during this period. So there was a variety of different responses coming out from sites within the country. And, you know, I fielded calls from quite a few colleagues to ask what is going on. But at the end of the day, I think it boils down to every site being judged on their own, in determining what they will do for their own population, because every trial site is going to have a peculiar population to them, and their responses will be guided by that. So the two aspects that we needed to look at from a site level was ensuring safety of the participants and the staff that are employed at sites. And there was a second aspect that was key that somehow got forgotten a lot of the time, was what is the alternative for patients that are following up at a site for a medical trial, a clinical trial, or normal medical practice. So with our site in Newtown in Johannesburg, one of the key things that we looked at was what we needed to do to ensure our safety. And then what was the realistic chances of our patients being helped in a way that won't further compromise their health if we needed to close. And it was a very quick decision for us to decide to stay open, you know, obviously with a few provisions in place. So we needed to be very, very actively involved with screening every person that entered our site. So we actually had protocols put into place and an SOP of sorts developed really, really quickly. And this started with actually reaching out to patients and visitors to the site before they planned to come in. And the basic screening questionnaires were done telephonically or via email. and anybody with symptoms were managed in a different manner compared to those with no symptoms. And then extending to site visits then, on the day of the visit when people came into site, we needed to screen them again before they actually entered the site. So we incorporated a proper screening desk where patients were identified, screened, and then dealt with in a particular manner. So the summary is that if patients had to walk into the site and have symptoms that made us worry about a possible COVID infection, these patients were immediately managed in a different way. So we needed to incorporate quite a few things at the site to get this done. So ranging from the usual that you would expect and you're accustomed to, if you walk into your local Woolworths, you're going to be faced with hand sanitizers and the masks you need to be wearing. So that's a standard that we've applied across our site. The hand sanitizers are at multiple locations in our site. Every patient who doesn't have a mask is given a mask at that moment for them to keep. And we went a little bit further than that. So in our waiting room, we've needed to create sufficient space to accommodate the social distancing requirements. We have PPE for all of our staff that will be in contact with patients. This includes gowns and face shields and gloves. And we've also invested in an ultraviolet C sterilizer, which is used multiple times during the day in between patient visits, and especially if there was a patient that was displaying any sorts of symptoms at all. We also needed to create an isolation room where patients could be quickly sent to and assessed at haste by the doctors that are at work, and these patients were then treated and sent back in a manner that did not compromise their health. I think our strategy worked really, really well at our site because the gratitude that the patients have in being able to turn to a site in times of concern, in times of a health need, was emphasized many times during site visits. Sometimes these patients just needed to have a little bit of reassurance that somebody is there looking after them, and that's key, I think, in the environments that we are in. There's a lot of anxiety, not just for clinical research staff, but also for patients as well. I did a quick analysis of what we had experienced during this time. So we had never closed our site. There were times when we rescheduled visits and closed on a day. So generally a Friday, we closed for about 3 or 4 weeks on a Friday, where we could accommodate the patients in a safe manner from Monday to Thursday. And as the trials continued, the visits continued, the patients wanted to come in to be seen by us. We just continued working along those lines. And up till today, in excess of 90% of our patients' visits were conducted on time. We had about 2% of patients that were too scared to come to site, and we needed to do virtual consultations with them. And about 8% of patients had visits that were delayed, primarily because of some or other adverse event where we felt that it might not be safe for the patient to actually travel and come to site. So all in all, I think, as Nathaniel had said, the South African clinical research environment and our sites in particular are pretty quick to adapt to what is going on in the environment. And I feel like what we have accomplished at Newtown is similar to what other places have done in the country. And in doing this, we have actually managed to stay open and have business run as usual within our control. There have been the instances where sponsors prematurely terminated studies and sponsors suspended recruitment on quite a lot of studies, which has had a significant impact on sites. But I think it is too early to tell what the true financial impact is going to be. I think given that we are open for business and we are seeing feasibilities come through and approvals for further studies coming through, I do think that it is a stormy ride at the moment. I do think there will be casualties, but I think if we are able to grasp this moment, we will all come out a little bit stronger. That's the view that I've got from my site in Newtown. And I know that Susanne Rolse is also in Johannesburg, so maybe we can reach out to her and get her perspective of what's going on at her site. Susanne?
Susanne, are you online?
Okay, Dr. Mitha, I don't think Susanne is online, but if I can just continue for another minute or two, because I think one of the key things that we are not... Oh, okay. Sorry, Susanne, is that you?
Yes, that's me, but it's fine. You can continue. I'll wait for you.
No, please go ahead. I think what you got to say is very, very important. I'm holding on here.
So much. So my name is Susanne Rolse, which is directed party. This is the impact that COVID had on our site, and listening to you is pretty much almost the same. But so I'll just quickly rush through it. So since the lockdown was implemented, we had to adhere to the regulations, which meant that we had to stop all active enrollments on most of the vaccine studies till at least October 2020, except for the COVID study that's currently running at the moment on our side. We are currently only doing follow-up visits as well as illness visits of participants that was enrolled prior to the lockdown. We are also adhering to social distancing, as you've mentioned before. Participants are triaged before they enter our clinic. Also, the number of participants are restricted into the clinic. For both staff and participants, they all have to wear the mask at all times, and also appropriate PPE according to the risk of exposure. We also have our illness visits that's happening separately from the normal follow-ups. What we've done is also we are sanitizing our clinics at least twice a day. And then when it comes to home visits, Prof usually tells us and give us a go-ahead if we need to do a home visit, if it's really necessary. And if it's done, it needs to be done with our staff having the appropriate PPE. Our participants, however, are aware that they can call on us 24/7. We have constant communication with our participants, with our research assistants. As for our maternal studies, we are still conducting delivery visits, and our investigators are still actively doing our follow-ups on SAEs and AEs to ensure that our patients are safe. So the challenges that we face is obviously that we had to stop enrollments. We created 2 clinics at Vida, one clinic that is just running the COVID study, and the other clinic doing obviously the follow-ups and the illness visits, meaning that we had to split our staff between the 2 clinics. And another challenge that we also had is that our staff were getting sick, infected with COVID-19. That means it put a strain on the healthy staff that's in the clinic that had to deal with the daily activities on site, but we are managing. Another challenge that we faced, but it's now seeming to be coming okay, was remote monitoring. Because what then happens is the monitors will do a telephone call, and then it become either the study coordinator or the investigator's duty to go through source and then sort out the queries, etc. In terms of planning moving forward, we have gotten Rahima Musa on board to be our satellite site to help us with continuation of the studies. There are a couple of studies in the pipeline. which includes maternal studies, COVID studies, TB studies, as well as Rota studies. Yeah, so that is in short what I have from Vida. Thank you so much.
Susanne, thank you very much for that information, and Dr. Mitha as well. So since we are running a bit behind time, I know that SACRA is intending to have a site-specific webinar in future, and I'm sure that both of you will then also participate there. I think at the end of it, it's quite clear that sites should continue to find ways by which they can continue with patient enrollment in a safe manner. Because as we said, we are an essential service and we cannot stop clinical trials on non-COVID related diseases. So I think as far as that is concerned, every single trial, site really has a very important job to do. Thank you so much for both of you. I would like to continue with the ethical aspects, and that is with Marzelle Haskins. I think most of us know Marzelle as the lady behind Pharma Ethics, as well as she was chairperson for NHREC for quite some time. So Marzelle, I would like to hand over to you, and that is really talking about the changing landscape and the new ethics approach in clinical trials. Marzelle, are you there?
Sorry, I just unmuted myself quickly. Okay, so I just want to make a correction that I wasn't chairperson of the National Health. I was just chairperson of one of their subcommittees on accreditation of ethics committees, just to sort that one out. Okay, so yes, it was very interesting listening to all the previous speakers, you know, mentioning all the important issues that they have to deal with during this period of our lives, and then to appreciate how that all comes into with the ethical issues that we battle with on a daily basis when we look at COVID-19, or what they specifically call emergency care sort of research. So research in health emergencies presents complex issues, ethical issues and challenges. And this prompted the WHO to publish a list of key ethical guidance documents to ensure the ethical research in emergency situations such as COVID-19. So they actually listed some documents that ethics committees and researchers can use during the conduct of what they call emergency health research. And so what I'm going to try and do in the 10 minutes that I'm allowed is to just quickly identify some of the challenges that was, you know, named in these documents, and also to then just try and allude to some of the suggestions that these documents have in terms of how we can cope with these challenges. So the first challenge identified is the risk, is the need to accelerate knowledge, which some of our previous speakers have also alluded to. So we all know that the development of treatments and vaccines is quite a lengthy process, and it normally requires extensive time-consuming research. But we agree that a health emergency calls for accelerated development and access, but this should, however, not overshadow the need to do ethical research. Okay, so one of the risks of accelerated research is that the participants might consider any intervention better than nothing. So they will gladly participate in the research without actually really considering the risks and benefits. Furthermore, the accelerated research might also urge regulators to allow the use of medication that is not registered specifically for COVID-19 on an off-label basis. Now, this may result in safety and efficacy concern, but also bring a concern about as to the reduced availability for those indications in the treatment for which the in the treatment for which it's actually been effective. Right. So how do we accelerate research without compromising patient safety and quality data? So firstly, consideration should be given to coordinate national and international research projects to avoid needless repetition, because we often find that the same clinical trials are conducted elsewhere in the world or elsewhere in Africa. So sponsors and host countries should maybe agree in advance to communicate some of the positive outcomes to local populations and to maybe provide some sort of compassionate use of treatments that was found to be effective before regulatory approval. It can also be ethical to offer individual patient investigational interventions on an emergency basis, based on the MIURI framework. Okay, so the MIURI framework was actually developed during the Ebola outbreak, and that was a framework that the WHO put there to say in which instances we may give individual patients investigational interventions in emergency cases. I'm not going to go through the framework. You're welcome to Google it, or you can ask me later on if we have some time, because just for the interest of time, but it's spelled M-E-U-R-I, the MIURI framework. All right, so so that was kind of guidelines that we have in terms of accelerated knowledge, when the ethical issues we have when we need to get accelerated knowledge, what we can do to protect participants. The second challenge that we have is upholding public trust when we're doing this research. And I think we were all made aware, we are all aware of issues where there were protests because of certain COVID-19 studies that were conducted. And I think in most of those instances, it was probably just because of people not being 100% aware of what is going on, and this was not communicated to them properly, right? So public trust will assist with study recruitment and the completion of study. But unfortunately, participants' trust in governments and in the healthcare system of the countries may be somewhat fragile, right? Like I'm sure we have in our country. So it's very important to have a kind of an early public engagement where we recognize local traditions and communications with communities to understand what their needs are of the research and to try and explain to them exactly why the research is being conducted. All right. So without this kind of engagement, the research is unlikely to have a lasting impact or inspire any kind of policy making. Furthermore, the process for distribution of potential benefits must be transparent to communities. To ensure that there is some kind of a public awareness of who will be prioritized for research and treatments, because there's often a misconception that once research starts or once treatment is available, that everybody will have access to this. But obviously, treatment and research and treatment will have to be prioritized for people such as healthcare workers, the elderly, and immunocompromised people. So if this can be communicated to communities from the start of the research or even before the start of research, it might avoid a lot of mistrust and a sense of exploitation from communities. The next point, the next ethical issue that is raised is the issue of scientifically valid research. Now, we all know that unscientific research is unethical research. So research in health emergencies must therefore still be scientifically valid and have social value. So it is possible that researchers may have to deviate from your typical study designs to accelerate knowledge. But this does not mean that participants must be exposed to risky research if useful results are improbable. So once again, proposals must be developed with feedback from communities to ensure appropriate research design, which will benefit local populations. Selection criteria must be justified in relation to the risks and benefit of research populations to ensure that vulnerable populations are not unfairly included in high-risk research or excluded from research that may have potential benefit just on the grounds of them being vulnerable. Research must also be designed to be feasible within the cultural, social, and political settings in which the research is conducted. Right, then the next one that was also brought up by previous speakers is the whole issue of flexible ethics review and oversight. So independent ethics review of health research offers research participants a safety net, and it ensures a certain level of public accountability. But normal timeframes and procedural requirements that we normally find ourselves with research ethics committees may delay approvals, and it might have a negative impact on emergency research. So review process and timelines must be altered to support expedited or rapid reviews without compromising ethical standards and the protections offered by the independent review. The following can be considered, for example, approval of a generic protocol in advance and then rapidly modifying it in terms of a specific context. Secondly, applications can be fast-tracked with expedited timelines and flexible communications. And thirdly, the conduct of initial fast-tracked reviews can be then continued, initial fast-track reviews can be done and approved, and then review and oversight can be continued after the approval. So in many developing countries, however, there is a lack of capacity for expedited review due to various reasons, such as a lack of infrastructure or a lack of expertise. So consideration should then also be given to a kind of a collaborative ethics review between local and international ethics committees, or as in the South African context, local and international institutional ethics committees. I've personally found that there's been quite a lot of communication between the ethics committees in South Africa. And for example, if Pharma Ethics gets a specific submission, we will then find out from the other committees whether they've actually had the submission, and we will then compare notes and work together, right? And that helps a lot in terms of fast-tracking approvals, because we can get a lot more, input into the research, because we're getting it from other people as well. Then lastly is, of course, the issue of informed consent. Now, obtaining proper informed consent in developing countries is challenging, even in non-emergency situations. And this is mostly due to language barriers and illiteracy and vulnerability, etc. So if you now go and you add fear and desperation that you deal with during health emergencies, it makes this even more complex. In desperation, yes.
Marzelle, I'm so sorry. I just heard that the system is going to shut down at 4 o'clock.
Oh, my word. Okay.
I do apologize about this. So if I can just tell everyone, the recording will be available to all the attendees. We received a couple of questions. We're going to get those answered, and it will be sent out to all the attendees, the questions and the answers. And Marzelle, perhaps at that stage, you can also send your summary, if you don't mind. I'm so sorry for interjecting, but I was just told it will shut down at 4 o'clock.
Okay.
All right. I can just wrap up, and I hope it will give us another minute or two, because I do have something that I would like to share with you, just as part of a wrap up. Okay, I'd like to thank everyone that made it to this meeting. I see that we didn't get enough time to actually answer all your questions, but we will attend to all your questions and send them back to you. What we would like to share with you is that SACRA plans to continue having these meetings every 6 to 8 weeks. we're going to have another session in August 2020. The August 2020 session will be the SACRA breakfast meeting. So if you recall, each quarter in the past, we'll have a SACRA breakfast meeting, which will hold for about 4 hours in a specific day. So we will inform you of the day when that will be available. What you need to know is that this next coming session will be a paid session. All members of SACRA will not need to pay for this session, but if you're not a member of SACRA, we will advise you on the cost of registration of this session. You will understand that SACRA is a non-profit organization that is self-funded, and we need to continue to be able to be operational. We need to continue and fund SACRA, and this is another way of funding SACRA. In the next meeting, we plan to have the SAPRA CEO or any representative from SAPRA, and as per the discussion today, you have noted that there is a lot of information that we need to consolidate with SAPRA. So it is impossible for us to continue without the input of SAPRA in everything that we do. We are also going to have Prof. Blockman, who will be okay, so I'm experiencing connection problems. Who will be the who is the HREC Council Chair at UCT? He will be joining us to continue the ethics discussion that has been started already. And we're going to have an international recognized market expert to give us more detail on what we have touched on when we talked about the pipeline and the forecasting that Alex and Nathaniel have touched on. Additionally, at the end of last year, we collected data from different stakeholders in the industry to assess the market of clinical trials in South Africa. We would like to present 2 reports at that meeting, which will give the drivers and the challenges as noted by the stakeholders. It is very important to actually have reports that actually document how we as stakeholders see the drivers of clinical trials and what are the challenges and how can we mitigate those challenges. We'll also give a report on the influence of South African clinical trials into the market of South Africa, actually into the economy of South Africa. So we know that we are contributing a lot into the economy, but we have not had any report that actually give us that measuring point that shows how much we influence the economy. So thank you so much for your attendance, and we will get back to you with all your questions that you have raised. Thank you.